International Relations Capsule for the Shankar IAS Academy. Today we are going to discuss India-US defense cooperation. We have just discussed the Quad last week, and you may wonder why we have again gone back to defense cooperation between the United States and India. This is because of two important developments. As you may recall, the agenda of the Quad summit was very carefully prepared not to highlight the security and defense aspects of it. Instead, it talked about the pandemic, it talked about climate change, it talked about maritime cooperation, it talked also about the need for an open, inclusive Indo-Pacific. But within days after that, there was a meeting between United States and China in Alaska, where the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and the National Security Advisor of the United States met not only the Foreign Minister of China, but also a higher level representative from China. And most unexpectedly, this particular meeting turned out to be a confrontation. This was, in fact, the first time that the Americans were meeting the Chinese after President Biden had taken over as the President of the United States. And Mr. Biden's policy was supposedly softer towards China, more calibrated, more thought of. But in this particular meeting, what happened was the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, spoke quite openly to the Chinese in the presence of the reporters and photographers. This does not normally happen. Normally, the first few minutes are for pleasantries and so on. And then after the press leaves, you discuss basic issues. But Mr. Blinken chose to start the meeting with a direct attack on China, for all this China has been doing in the recent months and years, and challenging China, saying that we are willing to cooperate with you, but at the same time, we'll counter you as far as security aspects are concerned, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And the Chinese delegation reacted equally confrontationally. And the exchange that took place was quite appealing, quite amazing, because they did not use diplomatic language. They used a very confrontational language. This surprised everybody, but this revealed the fact that concerns about China's expansionism and China's role in the Indo-Pacific have been uppermost in the mind of the Americans. And the Chinese were also not relenting on this. So we got a taste of how Mr. Biden was going to deal with the Chinese. And within hours after that, the Defense Secretary, General Lloyd James Austin is a general, also Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, that is Defense Minister. And he visited two of his close allies, that is Japan and South Korea, on his first trip abroad. And the third country that he visited was India. This also came as a surprise because India is not one of the designated allies of the United States. And therefore, inclusion of India in his first trip abroad was also significant. And he held discussions with our Defense Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, in Delhi. And here again, there were some very interesting aspects. The Quad summit had just finished, and the agenda of the Quad summit was described in such a way that it was not an alliance or a defense agreement, but something more than that, covering various aspects. But the first item which the United States picked up for deeper consultation with India at the level of the defense secretary, defense ministers on both sides, turned out to be India-US cooperation in the field of defense. That is why we are discussing this now. How is the defense cooperation between India and US going? There was nothing dramatic or important as a decision at this meeting. Basically, it was getting to know meeting. Mr. Rajnath Singh had spoken to General Austin earlier, and he had invited General Austin to visit India. And the fact that he came in his first visit itself was in fact surprising even to us. So the important thing that happened there was that India-US cooperation, among all the other things that they discussed at the Quad, turned out to be defense cooperation, and they decided to strengthen it. So to step up cooperation in defense with India, to work closely with two commands of the United States. There is one, the Indo-Pacific Command that we normally deal with. And now they added the Central Command, which is the bigger command, which is also in the Pacific region with its headquarters in Bahrain. So this is the first time that India and the United States have decided to work with two military commands of the United States. This has some meaning because this means that we are expanding our cooperation in the India-Pacific. Also, Africa region is also covered by the Central Command. So this was announced by Defense Minister Rajnath Singh after discussion with General Austin. So it was recalled at that time that this close cooperation is facilitated or made possible by the fact that India is already a signatory of the 3 foundational agreements for defense cooperation between India and the United States. You must be familiar with these agreements. They are, of course, tongue twisters, but still they are more known by the abbreviation. The first is the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, which is normally known as LEMOA. That was the first basic defense agreement India had signed with the United States, which deals obviously with logistics arrangements, how we can exchange our facilities, make use of the facilities of the two countries, and close cooperation was one of the first agreements. The second agreement was the communication, the LEMOA was signed in 2016, and the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement is called COMCASA, C-O-M-C-A-S-A, in 2018. And the final one, more recently, in 2020, is called Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, or BECA. So it was pointed out to us long ago that India-US defense cooperation, or for that matter, any country's defense cooperation with the United States will mean first signing of these 3 fundamental agreements. At that time, even Dr. Manmohan Singh's time, this was proposed. And nobody opposed these agreements, but we had some hesitation at that time. Because exchange of logistics facilities, exchange of communications, exchange of agreements on cooperation in geospatial cooperation, etc. These are all sensitive matters. Not that everything was going to happen immediately, but these are symbolic of the close cooperation that you have with the United States. So once you sign these agreements, the way is open for us to have a very close relationship. So this is what was reaffirmed at the meeting in Delhi. So these agreements lay down the terms of defense cooperation, such as information sharing and logistical support. So this is a message that has come from the United States that they would expect to step up their cooperation in defense. And we have now reached the status of an ally of the United States. Of course, India has not declared itself to be an ally. But even when we signed the first agreement, Defense Cooperation Agreement, it was announced that once these agreements are signed, India will have the same status as America's NATO allies in terms of possible cooperation in various aspects of defense. That is, availability of weapons and other weapon systems without any reservation. Then, if necessary, we can use their ports and airports, etc. They can use yours, and they can also exchange information, or shall we say intelligence, on if there are any common enemies about them, and also on the security situation in the world. So this visit by General Austin has formalized in a way India's close defense cooperation with the United States, even though we are still not considered an ally. And also it was established that among all the agenda items in the Quad, the most important is defense cooperation. And this is reassuring to us that this is happening at a time when we have a confrontation with China. And after the first withdrawals, there has been no progress in disengagement of China from Indian territory. So that is the background. But what I'd like to tell you is that this has been a long process. This did not happen just when the Quad met. Suggestions like this started coming from the Americans right from the time when the United States switched their interest from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was a big change in the world. There's the center of the world because of the end of the Soviet Union, etc. Because Atlantic was no more dangerous. And the United States focused its attention on the Pacific, basically because of the Chinese threat. So right from that time onwards, from President Bush's days, they have been talking about some kind of a pivot to India in the Indo-Pacific. At that time, it was called the Asia-Pacific. And several rounds of discussions were held. We knew the dangers from China, and therefore we were very cooperative, and discussions took place. But at the same time, we did not change anything in our structural arrangement with the United States. This happened for the first time in 2005, when Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, at that time our defense minister, visited Washington and signed a 10-year defense cooperation agreement for the first time in India-US history. We have had cooperation for a long time, meetings and with joint groups, exchange of ideas, etc. And in fact, this got intensified. I was in Washington those days, soon after our nuclear experiment of 1998. In fact, I went into the Pentagon building for the first time after our nuclear test. Before that, there was no opportunity for us to have any meeting inside the Pentagon, that is the defense headquarters of the United States. So the beginning was there, and we went into the Pentagon to learn about the responsibilities of a nuclear weapon state. What are the kinds of precautions that you have to take, etc. And then we had this defense agreement. And it was that defense agreement, actually, which led to the nuclear deal. So that's the linkage that you have to see. In fact, before the nuclear deal was discussed and signed in 2008, because initially it was signed in 2005, a few months after the defense agreement. And then 2005 itself, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was in Washington, and he signed this, the draft or initial agreement on the nuclear deal in 2005. Of course, it took 3 years to finalize the agreement in 2008. And this marked a different stage in India-US relations. So you have the defense agreement, you have the nuclear agreement, and the stage was set for greater cooperation between India and the United States. Again, status-wise, there was no change, but the first time or the second visit of President Barack Obama to India in 2015, January, to attend our Republic Day celebrations, marked another turning point in India-US defense cooperation. Because there, in the joint statement signed between Prime Minister Modi and President Obama, a clear indication was given that India and the United States will work jointly in the Indo-Pacific. And that is when the Chinese started criticizing us, that there is a collusion between India and the United States in the Indo-Pacific. And in that context, further discussions took place. And India had this new concept of making in India to reduce our purchase of arms from abroad and try to manufacture them in India itself. And so a joint designing and development of defense equipment was thought of, and some agreements were reached and some projects were launched. In other words, India and the United States not only buy or exchange equipment, but also jointly manufacture these in India with US collaboration. Another step in defense cooperation. And following that, India was declared a major defense partner in 2016. And that was the change in the institutional arrangements. India was given a new status. So far, we are only strategic partners. At that time, of course, we also used to use the word most defining, one of the most defining relationships of the 21st century. All these we forgot afterwards, but these were the words we used at that time. And when Mr. Narendra Modi went to Washington in 2016, he made this declaration in the US Congress that India and the United States has become major defense partners. And he was very poetic. He said that from now, you will have a new symphony in India-US relations. That was the highest point so far in India-US defense cooperation. So things were moving well, joint production and so on were thought of, some things got started off, etc. But then the change of government in the United States somewhat changed the atmosphere. When in 2017, Mr. Narendra Modi went to visit Mr. Trump, it was more about purchase of arms rather than anything else. Because Mr. Trump believed that only those who buy weapons from the United States, he was not very much interested in Make in India and all that. So those things were not pushed. But he expected us to buy more weapons from the United States. And we went along because we needed those weapons in any case. And that is how we broke the ice with Mr. Trump. He was happy with Mr. Modi because he bought this equipment and weapons from the United States. Just like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia bought about $360 billion worth of equipment. And so Mr. Trump was very close to Saudi Arabia. He will do anything for Saudi Arabia. So that became the yardstick. So our cooperation continued. We had our equipment, etc. But there was no other significant developments in defense cooperation during that period. And then came 2020. 2020 was, of course, a turning point in the history of the world itself. First, of course, the pandemic, which affected each and every country, each and every citizen of this universe. And close cooperation with everybody was necessary, particularly the United States needed help from us, which we provided, different stages of various kinds of cooperation. And then came the Chinese aggression or intrusion or occupation of territory belonging to us. And then our defense cooperation naturally grew. And that was the time when Donald Trump became openly supportive of India against China. Very specifically, he said repeatedly that India was not alone in resisting China, and particularly his Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, visited India a few times, and a dialogue, 2+2 dialogue, was established. That is, defense ministers and external affairs ministers of both sides sitting together and planning out foreign policy and defense policy. And it was at that time that all these agreements were signed. Lemoa and Becca and whatever, all these three major agreements were signed, and 2+2 meetings gave India-US cooperation a military dimension. And that was part of our policy of strengthening our defense forces in the context of the Chinese action. And though no physical support was given to us, but various arrangements for exchange of communication. So in fact, Mr. General Austin said when he came to Delhi that these agreements, particularly the last one, the BECA, relating to exchange of information, became operational at the time of the Chinese action against India. So our cooperation defense in practice became very close to the United States towards the end of the Trump administration. And that is why generally there was a feeling that Trump administration's continuation will be helpful to India. There was an impression like that because democratic governments normally don't get involved in so many details about defense, and they always keep a distance, etc., etc. But when a change took place, we welcomed it like the rest of the world, because whatever may be the policy of President Biden, it will be predictable, it will be consistent, it will be understandable. We can discuss with him, and he will not send tweets either approving or disapproving of India. So such a good feeling was there when Mr. Biden took over. And then several declarations came about his foreign policy, various nuances. In a sense, he went back to the President Obama's days, where it was established that India-US relationship would be one of the determining relationship of the 21st century. And President Biden opened his arms and hearts to India, particularly in the context of Indo-Pacific. And then the idea of reviving or formalizing the Quad came up. So in the Quad, of course, as I explained to you in my last capsule, there were other agenda items, all equally important. But it was clear at that time itself that this was going to be a defense cooperation. And that is what happened at the Delhi meeting of defense ministers. So our cooperation at the institutional level, at the agreements level, and now at the operational level, in the sense that the Indian Army will work with the Central Command as well as the Pacific Command. And therefore, we will, of course, no details were given as to what we'll be doing. There are already exercises in which all the 4 countries have participated. These exercises will continue. And apart from that, there will be a large number of logistic activities and also the arrangements to work military to military, not necessarily through the Foreign Office. So direct involvement in the 2 militaries. Of course, nobody talked about any other country, but it was quite obvious that the defense aspect of Quad has come into full force. We're still not saying that we are allies, but it is clearly understood that our defense cooperation has moved from just being a major defense partner, but also a major, what shall we say, collaborator or friend or strategic partner. So 2 things have come very clearly in this. that President Biden is not going to be all that soft as he appeared initially. He was willing to confront China. He is also willing to openly support India, which would mean not only defense cooperation, but also all the other issues that we have. New technology being available to Indian defense forces, new cooperation under these three major agreements. And though we may not hear much about it, we know fully well that there will be a certain amount of interoperability of our forces. If necessary, we'll be able to act unitedly, because at the moment it is only a security dialogue partnership, but if necessary, the situation so demands, this can in fact go forward as a near ally of the United States. But I must also mention one or two points about the Austin visit. Just before Mr. Austin took off to India, a senator, a US senator called Menendez, wrote a letter to him saying that, you are going to India, you are going to build cooperation with India, etc. But please also tell the Indian leaders that we also expect them to remain democratic and concerned about the minorities and move from India away from the democratic structure. So these are the criticisms that are being heard around. The Freedom House brought our status down to partly democratic. It never happened. All through, since independence, India was fully democratic countries. They have different lists. So there is a democratic countries list, and there is a partly democratic country, then authoritarian, then dictatorial, etc. So China would come into that category. So India was always in the category of fully democratic countries. But because of certain developments, including what happened in Jammu and Kashmir, what happened in Ladakh, what happened about the nationality questions, some complaints about minorities being not treated well, etc. And these are all being compiled by several Western agencies. And that is how our status was reduced to this. And this has led to discussions in the US Congress and in the British Parliament. So we, of course, have rejected all that. We don't need anybody's certificate to be a democracy. But life is like that. In Western countries, they interfere in other people's affairs. So he was told, Mr. Austin was told, it's fair enough that you go and discuss all this, but please also tell the Indian leaders about our concern about human rights violations in India, and also some kind of illiberal democracy. That is the impression that they are generally creating. Of course, we reject all these arguments, but they do sometimes mention it. And apparently, after the discussions, General Austin actually mentioned this aspect to our authorities, the defense minister and the foreign minister, but they seem to have generally ignored it. We have not raised any issue of it. If they have to speak about it, let them speak. And we did not want to make an issue of it at this time. But this is something that we have to bear in mind, because increasingly, as our cooperation and strategic involvement increases, they will also, Mr. Biden and his group, including the Vice President, they have these humanitarian, human rights concerns, and they will also come up. We'll have to take the good and the bad with it. And therefore, there was an indication that Mr. Austin gave that such things will happen in the future also. And we, of course, are welcoming all this. At the same time, we have our concerns with China, China being our immediate neighbor, and they're occupying our land. We are still discussing the border issues with them. So we cannot just really jump into an alliance and we provoke China. So we are soft about it. So we are soft about all that they want us to do immediately in terms of military activities. And also we are soft in terms of their criticism that India is not democratic enough. And the last point is that he went from India directly to Afghanistan, which was a surprise visit, in fact, a secret visit. It was not announced earlier. You know, the situation in Afghanistan is such that it's not easy for anybody to visit after having announced these things, because there are a lot of confusion there and terrorism and violence. So he went quietly, but this is a very important moment in US involvement in Afghanistan. President Trump had agreed to withdraw troops, and the troops should have gone back by last Christmas, but they have not gone. The agreement with Taliban is not working very well. And now they have made a new proposal that there should be a conference in Turkey with the involvement of concerned parties. And for the first time, India was never part of this peace process, though we are involved in Afghanistan. So General Austin must have discussed Afghanistan very clearly with our leaders. We don't know the details, but an assurance of some kind to us that Americans will leave only after there is a stable government in Afghanistan. That has been our demand. Because if they just leave saying that, okay, let Taliban run this country, then all the ghosts of the past will come back and India will have a tough time in Afghanistan. So General Austin must have also shared his assessment as to what is going to Afghanistan. So in other words, what started in 2005 by Dr. Manmohan Singh and Pranab Mukherjee, it has taken many years, but it has reached a conclusion in the sense of an institutional arrangement and arrangements of cooperation in the field of defense. Thank you very much.